בוקר טוב לכולם, שלום. לי קוראים שי כהן, אני ראש התוכנית למוזיקה וטכנולוגיות פה באוניברסיטת בר-אילן. אני מדבר עכשיו בעברית, אבל הכנס שלנו יהיה באנגלית. יש לנו אורחים שמצטרפים אלינו גם בזום וגם בפועל שמדברים באנגלית, ולכן אנחנו נדבר באנגלית, אבל לפני שאני פותח את הפתיחה הרשמית, אני מבקש רק לומר שזה ברור, אבל אני אגיד את זה בצורה ברורה ובעברית, שאם חלילה תהיה אזעקה או שיהיה משהו כזה, לא צריך להיכנס לפאניקה, יש לנו פה מרחבים מוגנים ממש, כלומר לא צריך רק לחצות את האזור של המרחב הפתוח פה, ואפשר להיכנס לשם לכמה דקות ולחזור. אני מקווה שזה לא יקרה, ושיהיה לנו יום יום. This is mine. הדבר הבא זה לפחות טלפונים. So, good morning everyone. It is with a great excitement that I welcome you to the conference Diving Between Disciplines, hosted here at the Department of Music, Bar-Ilan University. Today marks a significant milestone for sound music and technology community in Israel. This gathering brings together researchers, artists, technologists, educators to explore the rich intersection of music and innovation. Our program is designed to reflect the dynamic and interdisciplinary nature of music technology, and we will hear from the leading voices in the field. Today's agenda includes sessions such as No Sound in a Vacuum, Between Disciplines, and 21st Century Musicality, each digging into the diverse aspects of our field. Additionally, we will experience a lecture performance on real-time microtonal piano, and concert showcasing acoustic works and performances integrating voice, percussion, and technology. So before we get started, I would like to thank the people working behind the scenes, Professor Aviv, head of the Department of Music, and all the good people from the administration, Yuval Adler and Goni Peles and SaMoT organization, which you can see here. And Amir, that was very helpful with all the connection here on stage. And all the musicians, the composer, and my dear students, whose work you will hear during the lunch break outside. Additionally, I would like to thank the conference supporters, the Bar-Ilan Office of Vice President for Research, the Office of Vice President for the International Affair and the Third Mission, Professor Adler and the Israel Composer League, and the Austrian Culture Forum. Thank you all for being part of our exciting day. Let's make it inspiring and connecting. Enjoy the conference.
Hi everyone. So welcome. Thank you all for coming. I think before we start today's event, well, first of all, thank Shai and everyone you mentioned, and also people like Freddie and Ahuha and Michal and everyone who's been helping us behind the scenes make this kind of slightly insane setup for a day happen. I think before we dive into this very varied conference today, we should maybe talk a little bit about some of the kind of thoughts behind the whole, what does it mean interdisciplinary? What are we talking about here today? There won't be a test, but it's just something to think about. Probably we'll use the words more loosely than we're going to present them right now, but it's something to kind of guide our thought throughout this day.
Yeah, thank you and welcome. So,
we also didn't present ourselves. So I'm Yuval Adler. This is Peles, and we just started this organization right here, SaMoT, which is Sound, Music, and Technology in Israel. If you're curious about that, come talk to us later, and on with the show.
Yeah. And we'll also talk about SaMoT later, more detail. But now a little bit about interdisciplinarity, which is a term you saw in the title of the conference, and it's a bit of a vague term. It is used in different ways. It's often conflated with related terms. So we thought it would be nice to offer a theoretical framework just to kind of situate the different things we'll see throughout the conference. And we're drawing here on a theory by Alexander Jensenius, who is a music technologist based in Norway. He's done a lot of interesting work in this area. And if we imagine or try to visualize the disciplinary space where different practices can be situated, so you see this circle, this represents the disciplinary space. We can represent a single discipline as a smaller circle, and this is the standard, I don't know if standard, but the conventional way of working, right? So we have a single discipline that we are focusing on that. This is what our practice consists of. This is what is usually called intradisciplinary work. Now, if we introduce other circles into that large circle, but we still have this central circle, this is what is called cross-disciplinary work. So we view the other circles from the perspective of the central discipline, but we don't really, they don't touch each other, right? We still focus on that practice. And I'm going to keep that abstract. I'm not going to give examples because there will be a lot of examples, but just something to think about. And now if we push the circles closer to the central circle, now we have what is called multidisciplinary work. And here you consider the circles, the disciplines touch one another, but they are still distinct. And this is a common situation when you have a team of practitioners and each practitioner is focusing on their own discipline. But together they create something which is bigger than each of the disciplines individually. And now this is where we move into interdisciplinary. And here you consider the circles start to overlap one another. And this is the characteristic of what is a strict interdisciplinary work, when there are areas where it's unclear which discipline is the practice. And you can see this overlapping circles. And if we push further in that direction, we get into what is called transdisciplinary work. And here we cross the boundaries of the different disciplines. And the interesting thing about that, if we view all these diagrams together, is that now we completed the full cycle, right? Because the transdisciplinary work can be framed now as a new discipline, and we are back into intradisciplinary work. So I hope this framework will be useful for you as you experience the different contributions that we'll see throughout the conference. And I think that's also a good opportunity to introduce the schedule, because we have a lot of events, a very rich events for you inside this conference. So, Yuval.
One thing I'll be asking myself throughout the conference is where is music technology on this? Has it become its own discipline, and what's part of that one discipline? And where am I in that process with my own work, and where are others that are going to be speaking today? It's something to try and think about. So the schedule. We're now at welcome and opening remarks with already a slight delay, as is tradition. Our first keynote very, very soon will be Marko, which Goni will present in a second. Right after the keynote, we'll go into our first session, No Sound in a Vacuum. The sessions are structured such that we have 4 very short 15-minute presentations with no questions, and then a 20-minute roundtable discussion. And during that discussion, save your questions for that moment. That's when we're going to try and have this conversation between people from different disciplines. So each of these sessions will have people from psychoacoustics and artists and different fields, engineering. And so that's something to keep in mind. The lunch break, will have a light lunch provided. There's also coffee breaks between the sessions. After the lunch, or during the lunch break, sorry, there's going to be installations outside. Some students from Bar-Ilan, some members joining us from Tami, which is a makerspace in Tel Aviv. Pianoid, which a lot of you have already seen and heard this morning. So as you take your sandwiches out, keep walking. We decidedly didn't bring food that requires a plate and a fork because we wanted you to walk around, talk amongst yourselves, see the installations, and enjoy that time. After that lunch break, we'll have 2 back-to-back concerts, a lecture performance with Shai and Yuval, and then a concert of acousmatic works with 1 extra piano piece. Another break, and then the final keynote, Goni from MIT, which we'll present as he comes in, and then the final session, 21st Century Musicality. Small closing remarks, a break for some wine and cheese, and then a closing concert for the entire day. So stick around for the wine and cheese, if nothing else. Yeah, I think we're ready to present Marko.
Yeah, I just add that you can access the schedule anytime on the website. If you want to save this QR code, just keep it handy and you can see this whole list of events. We hope that we will be in time, but probably there will be some delay. Yeah, I think we can now move to the first keynote. And yeah, it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce Marko Ciciliani. Marko was supposed to come here in person. Everything was already organized, but because of the situation, we had to cancel, and he's now joining on Zoom. A little bit about Marko. Marko is a composer, an intermedia artist, and a performer. He's also a professor for computer music at the Institute for Electronic Music and Acoustics, IEM, of the University of Music and Performing Arts in Graz. The focus of his artistic work lies in the composition of performative electronic music, mostly in audiovisual context. You see a lot of innovative stuff in his work, from interactive video, live design, laser graphics, and they often play an integral part of the composition. So it's no longer just sound, which is something we'll discuss in detail in the following session. Yeah, I'll let Marko begin. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy it.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this invitation. I feel very honored to be allowed to speak to you today. And as it was already pointed out, when you already said that everything was planned that I would be with you today, so unfortunately I had flight cancellations, and therefore I can only join you via Zoom. So in the next 30 to 40 minutes, I would like to present to you a talk titled Composing Transmedia and Modes of Encounter, Navigating Vertical and Horizontal Attention. So I will point out what I understand under the term composing transmedia. The layout of my talk looks as follows. So I will start with an introduction in which I'm also going to speak about so-called modes of attention, which will then lead me to a more detailed discussion of the transmedia composition. Then I will speak about some key criteria for this approach to composing, and introduce a couple of terms which I found useful, such as ideascapes, modes of encounter, and hermeneutic accrual. I will then present approaches to analyzing transmedia works, how they can be differentiated, and I will close with an outlook and the socio-political relevance of this approach, and eventually also the role of technology within it. There is a recurring suspicion in cultural theory that something essential has been lost in our modern modes of perception that have been induced by the current fragmentation of media environments. The terms vertical and horizontal perception have repeatedly been used to describe contrasting modes of attention. A vertical or deep mode of perception has been equated with introspective reflection and profound engagement with an artwork, whereas horizontal perception refers to scattered attention and inability to focus on one thing at a time, and therefore the quasi-random collection of fragments. Already long before the advent of social media, in his seminal critique of postmodernism, Frederick Jameson famously contrasted the depth of Van Gogh's peasant shoes with the surface of Warhol's diamond dust shoes, lamenting a collapse of meaning, a flattening of perspective, and a loss of verticality. In the domain of music, Marlies the Monk more recently echoes this concern. She describes a shift from the vertical listening of 19th century absolute music, rooted in introspection and transcendence, to the horizontal listening first introduced by John Cage's 4 minutes 33, where attention drifts across surfaces and context replaces structure. Both thinkers see this transformation as a form of diminishment. But what if the shift towards lateral attention, including today's practices of browsing, skimming, and sampling, is not a symptom of decline, but a new perceptual reality worth embracing? Claire Bishop offers a more generous and, I believe, more productive take. In her recent book, Disordered Attention, she suggests that vertical and horizontal attention are not mutually exclusive but dynamically intertwined. Our perception today doesn't just skim, it moves between modes, accumulates meaning across time and context. Where Jameson and de Monk see fragmentation and a lack of profound perceptual engagement, Bishop sees potential and a departure from a normative idealization of one particular mode of attention. This more generous understanding of attention brings up the question, what kinds of artistic forms are capable of working with, rather than against, our contemporary perceptual condition, the vertical and the horizontal? One answer lies in the practice of transmedia composition. In transmedia composition, an art project encompasses several artworks, each using a distinct combination of media. It is an approach to composition that deliberately evokes various modes of perception and where content flows across different media. It operates across media, offering so-called modes of encounter of different qualities between the audience and the artwork, inviting both deep engagement and associated drifts. Each individual part of a transmedia work can stand on its own, yet the pool of experience emerges only over time through what I call hermeneutic accrual. Audiences navigate across formats, contexts, and sensory environments, layering perspectives as they go. This way of working across media to construct meaning is not new. In fact, it might be as old as human culture. Throughout history, cultures have turned to multiple forms of expression to communicate complex ideas. Religions, for example, articulate what we might now recognize as an ideascape through texts, but also ritualistic practices, architecture, symbols, music, painting, and much more. Each element may function independently, but together they build a network of meaning. Importantly, no single medium holds the entire message. Meaning emerges through how these media interact across time, space, and experience. I would now like to give two examples from more recent culture for transmedia composition. The first one is Peter Adler. Peter Adler is an Austrian composer, and he offers a striking example of this transmedia principle. His project, Weizmann, started in 1980, with the most recent work being completed only in 2023. It spans a vast range of media, from rustling trees and city noise to graphs or photos, installations, and found sound-producing objects. Each piece is autonomous, yet all of them are connected through a shared conceptual lens, which is the exploration of noise and perception and the association of noise with the color white. I would also like to play an excerpt from Weizmann's Stage number 20. So just like with the other pieces, it's the demonstration of a particular kind of noise, or playing with this idea of white noise. These pieces don't build a narrative in the conventional sense, but they cohere through an evolving ideascape. A listener who encounters one piece in a gallery and another years later in a concert hall may still intuitively relate them to one another and piece together a larger conceptual structure and an evolving understanding of the project's focal point. Let's move to a different context. Björk's Biophilia from 2011 exemplifies transmedia composition in a popular music context. What was first released as an album in different artfully designed editions eventually expanded into a series of interactive apps, live performances, educational workshops, installations, and even a documentary movie. Each component offered, again, a different mode of encounter, yet they all circled around the core thematic constellation, the relation between nature, culture, and science. Here, too, the full scope of the work only emerges over time across different media. Transmedia composition then is not simply about using multiple media in a single work, as in multimedia or intermedia. It is about building a network of works, each autonomous but conceptually intertwined, and about engaging audiences through different perceptual and interpretive pathways. It rethinks composition not as a singular and linear act of authorship, but as a distributed, evolving process, one that mirrors how we increasingly consume, interpret, and construct meaning in a complex media landscape. In order to describe key characteristics of transmedia project, I would like to discuss three terms which I have already mentioned in passing. These are ideascape, mode of encounter, and hermeneutic accrual. An ideascape is the thematic or conceptual common denominator that is shared by all works that belong to a transmedia composition. It is the shared space of inquiry, which can be very abstract or a concrete narrative, and which connects the otherwise distinct artworks. Borrowing from terms like landscape and soundscape, ideascape emphasizes continuity and the interplay of top-down and bottom-up design processes. You can think of it as a field of gravity, where different pieces orbit within, each offering a unique vantage point, but all responding to the same code. We often speak about what a work of art is, but less frequently about how we come into contact with it. Yet this how, the conditions of engagement, the spatial and sensory framing, the audience's physical and cognitive positioning is just as important in shaping how we make sense of a work. I use the term mode of encounter to describe this aspect, the interplay of media, environment, and perceptual cues that shape how an audience meets an artwork. Some works ask us to sit in silence in a darkened hall. Others invite us to move, interact, scroll, touch, and speak. Some unfold through headphones in intimate proximity, others through multisensory installations in expansive spaces. Each of these settings carries its own codes, expectations, and affective textures, and each reshapes the meaning of the work it presents. In transmedia composition, designing distinct modes of encounter is part of the composition. The spatial layout, the sensory modality, the affordances of interaction, all of these define the mode of encounter and by extension, the interpretive possibilities. Because the parts of a transmedia composition are autonomous and presented at different times and places, audiences may encounter them in any order and at different times. Understanding unfolds cumulatively, not linearly, a process that I call hermeneutic accrual. While each individual work may suggest more vertical or horizontal attention, depending on the mode of encounter it proposes, the cumulative process itself inherently invites a horizontal perception. The space where the different works eventually come together is the audience's memory. This is where they gain a so-called asynchronous presence, asynchronous as they have been experienced at different times. The short-term memory activated in the moment of encounter interacts with long-term memory where filtered impressions of earlier works are stored. Each new encounter sheds light on the others, adding layers of nuance, resonance, or contradiction. Interpretation becomes dynamic. Vertical and horizontal attention interact to construct meaning. I would now like to present to you as a case in point my project White Rats, which illustrates how these concepts operate in practice. Structured around a fictional history of the electric guitar told from the vantage point of 2083, the project comprises three principal distinct components. A multimedia concert titled Downtown 1983, a performance lecture with the title Requiem for the Electric Guitar, and an installation titled Tombstone. There was also a publication of the project in the form of a book with an integrated USB stick, which also extends further the project and can be therefore considered a fourth part of the work. A fifth part is an online experience accessible via QR code titled White Rats Necromancy. Each part can be experienced independently. The concert immerses listeners in a performative present. The lecture performance starts as a pseudo-historical academic lecture that grows increasingly absurd, and the installation allows for open-ended interactive exploration. But together, they form a web of references, an ideascape about fiction, gender roles, history of music, and cultural fetishization. The audience may encounter one part live, another in a book, another maybe years later online. But each mode of encounter invites a different kind of engagement: passive listening, active reading, spatial exploration. And across these, the interplay between vertical and horizontal perception unfolds. At one moment, deep attention is rewarded, at another, it's lateral comparison that unlocks new insights. So I would like to play a couple of minutes of excerpts from each of these sections. So the first I would like to present is an excerpt from the very beginning of the piece, Downtown 1983. So in this piece, a fictitious concert is placed in the year 1983, played by 3 electric guitarists. So this has been recorded on video, and I'm interacting with this video throughout the 25-minute performance with live electronics, where I'm processing and building on top of the signals from those 3 electric guitars. So here is an excerpt from the very beginning, followed from an excerpt towards the end of the piece. I'm now moving on to the Requiem for the electric guitar, which is a performance lecture. Here I deliberately started out with a very sort of academic-looking lecture of a historian telling the history of the electric guitar from the perspective of the year 2083. And this lecture is then gradually becoming more absurd. So here is an excerpt from this lecture, which otherwise lasts 35 minutes. Over time, the electric guitar became a symbol of rock and roll and the rebelling youth. Unlike the acoustic guitar, which was played by men and women alike, the electric guitar was almost exclusively played by male musicians. Led by such towering figures such as Chuck Berry or Jimi Hendrix, it was turned into a sexualized symbol of male potency. The instrument became the most iconic phallic symbol and an embodiment of electric sound, a symbolism that probably reached its apex when Prince made it ejaculate. The symbolism took a life on its own in the practice of air guitar. Air guitar isolated and exaggerated the chauvinistic gesture while paradoxically performing self-castration by relinquishing the materiality of the instrument itself. As is well known, the metal genre celebrated the guitar as a tool to display masculinity. In order to match the tonal register of the idiomatic metal growl, in order to match this particular tonal register, metal musicians soon decided that 6 strings on the guitar didn't suffice anymore. The instrument had to go lower. So, at first, a 7th string was added, then an 8th, a 9th, a 10th, an 11th, and, well, you can guess where this is going. Strings were added until the instrument became unplayable. And now finally, an excerpt from the installation Tombstone. This project, the first 3 parts, have been published in the form of a book with an integrated USB stick. And in this book also this whole idea of the electric guitar is further developed. So for example, this concept with the 3 guitars, which the first part you saw is based on a review of this concept has been added. Of course, all of this is fictitious and therefore a sort of expansion of the overall artwork. So far I have focused on how transmedia composition unfolds over time and across different perceptual settings. As you have seen, White also uses a kind of traditional concert format, then this lecture format, installation format, and then also engagements with a book or another part with a hand showing with a website. So here I found those concepts like ideascapes, modes of encounter, and hermeneutic accrual useful to describe key characteristics. But to deepen the understanding, it is helpful to differentiate how exactly a particular content travels across different media. Or in other words, how does what I call ideascape sediment in the individual parts of a transmedia project, and what kind of relationships are created between those parts. And to this end, I've developed a typology of transmedia models. It is based on narratological theory, particularly Marie Lord Ryan's categories of transmedia storytelling, but adapted and expanded to suit the needs of music-based transmedia composition. These models are not meant to be strict categories, but lenses through which we can understand and compare different approaches. So let me briefly introduce 3 core models that I found useful so far. They're called expansion, translation, and segregation. In expansion, different parts of a transmedia project contribute complementary perspectives to a shared ideascape. Each component adds content or context that is not found in the others, creating a multifaceted view of the central concept. The relationship here is additive. There might be overlaps in the sense that particular motives reappear in different parts, but what dominates is that each part adds new content or unique perspectives. So if you take, for example, my project White Rex, we see that individual elements from the performance lecture, the requiem of the electric guitar, can be found in both of the other main parts. However, there is no overlap between the multimedia concert Downtown 1983 and the installation Tombstone, which is illustrated in this graph. A constellation with no overlaps at all would also be conceivable, which you see in the graph on the right side. In both illustrations, the dotted ellipse designates the shared ideascape. In translation, this involves recontextualizing material across different media in a way that changes how it is perceived. So unlike expansion, which introduces new content, translation is about reinterpreting the same idea or even the same material through a different medium. Translation highlights medium-specific differences and invites audiences to compare the form of engagement, not just the content. I would like to use again a project from myself as an example, which is the Pop Wall alphabet. It is a piece where sounds, images, and text are derived from the same conceptual base, and they provide unique aesthetic engagements, largely as a result of the unique affordances and specificities of each medium. So in Pop Wall alphabet, it's a project where I was interested to create great densities of material by using existing material from pop music. There are 26 sections, 26 musical pieces, where each piece represents one letter of the alphabet. And here I started out by taking one particular record from the history of pop music, and I superimposed all the songs, playing them at the same time, which leads to a very dense texture in which usually you really can't recognize what you're listening to. However, of course, some songs are shorter than others, and as the shorter ones disappear, the overall texture becomes more transparent. And so very gradually you first recognize, oh, wait a minute, this is this particular style of pop music, then you might recognize maybe the performer, and only towards the end, when 2 or 3 songs remain, you might recognize the songs themselves. What I find interesting in this whole process is this very rather abstract perception in the beginning, where you're not able to really identify anything concrete yet, and how this very gradually transitions into phases where you recognize certain materials and which starts to trigger also personal memories. So I've done this with 26 pop albums, which resulted in more than 5 hours of music. But I also carried out the same principle on the level of text. So I took all the texts from one particular pop album, all the lyrics, and applied an algorithmic process which scrambled the individual letters of the text. So what you see here on top is how such a text looks in the beginning. You don't recognize anything, so it looks completely random. But very gradually, as the text progresses, more and more words start to form, and eventually also fragments of sentences. So you see on the lower half of this page how this text looks towards the end. And only in the last one or two lines you see intact text. But basically here the process is the same. You start, you could say, like with complete noise, no recognizable patterns, and then very gradually understandable words come in, and fragments of sentences, and eventually intact sentences. I also carried this out with the art designs of the different albums that I used, and I superimposed all 26 of them, creating 26 different variations by applying different layering orders and algorithms of mixing colors. So here, again, we have the same idea. The idea doesn't change, like, or the content doesn't change as it does in the project wide threads, where each part really adds new information. Here, it's basically the same idea, the transition from a kind of more abstract and noisy state into recognizable patterns, and what this cognitively does. But I translate this idea from one medium to another, from music to text to image. So, therefore, when represented graphically, I have this overlap of the three spheres that are designating the individual parts. However, a complete recontextualization can also lead to the formation of different ideascapes. If you think, for example, of James Joyce's famous book Ulysses, it's a reimagination of Homer's Odyssey. It's situating its themes in a radically different cultural and temporal context, though. While the existence of a so-called homogeneous ideascape is usually considered to be the foundation of every transmedia project, the substantial alteration of context in transmedia translations often lead to different ideascapes, within which only a single key element of the content remains constant. So Odyssey's story world is a fundamentally different one than the one by Leopold Bloom. And this I tried to also illustrate with this image. So here we see again an overlap, a small overlap between the two spheres. Basically, this overlap is the character of Odysseus or Leopold Bloom, if I stick with this example. However, since the stories which are spanning around these two characters are so different in character, we can't really speak of a homogeneous ideascape anymore. And this is here illustrated with the two different dotted circles. Finally, we also have segregation. In segregation, a single element is removed from its original context and presented on its own. The content does not change, it is the framing that does. And yet, this reframing can radically alter the experience and interpretation of the work. Here, an example I would like to use is a piece by the Norwegian artist Thorolf Thurstad. The title is For One, For Many, For All. And in this piece, Thorolf Thurstad uses kinetic objects which are presented in a theatrical performance as a central element, but also in isolation as a gallery exhibition. In the first instance, these objects are interacting with performers on stage, and they gain a very human character, you could say, in this interaction, whereas in the installation, where they are presented individually, they appear much more as technical objects, as something very robotic. So the meaning really radically changes simply by isolating them from the music theater context and placing them in this setting of a gallery. The segregation shares similarities with transformation because both involve the change of context that leads to a qualitative shift. But in contrast to transformation, in segregation the change of context occurs through reduction or isolation, and this is what I tried to express with this image where like the segregation within a larger context is singled out. So these models are tools, they are not rules. A given project may move between them or combine even all three of them. But by naming them, it helps me to think more clearly about the compositional choices involved in transmedia work, and as this research evolves, I hope to discover and develop additional models. These models also point to how transmedia composition is not only about creating discrete works across media, but about designing relationships that invite vertical reflection, horizontal connection, or moments of dissonance and surprise. The models outlined above invite further experimentation. What happens if we push these structures to their limits? Can a transmedia composition, for example, include elements so different in scale or form that they barely seem to belong together, say a single haiku in one part and a durational 6-hour performance in another? Or if each part of a transmedia project offers a unique perspective on a central theme or ideascape, how strongly can they diverge before the sense of cohesion begins to fall apart? In other words, how far can it stretch the boundaries of the ideascape before its internal coherence dissolves? And what happens if it does? Is there a productive threshold where coherence begins to blur, yet a deeper kind of resonance emerges, not from clarity, but from tension, contrast, or even contradiction? And even the idea of translation, when applied beyond literature, raises intriguing questions. Joyce's Ulysses may transform the Odyssey, but what would a musical or visual transmedia equivalent look like? Can a single element provide a stable point of reference around which a multitude of contrasting ideascapes unfold? So naming the discussed standard models helps me to imagine such challenging approaches that raise interesting artistic questions that can only be explored in creative practice. These frameworks not only guide artistic inquiry, they offer a space for testing how meaning is constructed in complex multimodal environments. What is at stake is not merely innovation for its own sake, but a rethinking of how meaning is made, shared, and experienced in a world saturated with overlapping media and fractured attention. Transmedia composition does not demand that audiences consume everything, nor that they arrive at a single reading. Instead, it invites them into a process of assembling meaning, one that mirrors the fragmented, multi-perspective way we now experience the world. In this sense, transmedia composition is not only a compositional method, it is a socio-political gesture. As mentioned earlier, transmedia is not new. On the contrary, for as long as humans have expressed meaning through ritual, storytelling, architecture, music, and image, we have done so across media. But today, in a culture shaped by fragmentation, saturation, and disordered attention, transmedia composition gains new relevance. It resonates with how we already move through information, perception, and narrative, and offers a more deliberate, critical, and imaginative way of doing so. That is why it deserves to be explored more deeply, in my opinion, both artistically and theoretically. Not as a novelty, but as a practice that has always been with us and whose time, perhaps more than ever, has come. Transmedia composition is an inherently interdisciplinary endeavor. It draws from music, performance, visual arts, storytelling, and in many of these fields, technology plays a crucial role. Every mode of encounter is mediated, technologically as well as aesthetically. Whether it's the spatial sound of an installation, the interactivity of an app, or the intimacy of headphone-based listening, technology technology co-defines the conditions of perception. It also shapes whether an experience suggests deep attention, invites associated drift, or encourages playful exploration. Technology also allows for fragmentation and simultaneity. The ability to distribute components across formats, platforms, and timescales is fundamentally expanded and enriched by the choices technology offers. And this is where transmedia composition meets the core mission of this conference. It is a compositional approach that emerges from and responds to the technological realities we inhabit, largely by using the attributes of the technologies themselves. While technology is not always foregrounded, it is the quiet architect that is part of the dramaturgy, a structural, perceptual, and potentially political agent in the world. In that sense, transmedia composition serves as a model for interdisciplinary practice in music technology. It is a field where the technical, conceptual, and cultural dimensions can intersect in an integrated and exploratory way. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marko. Can you hear me? Great. Will you be staying for the panel? I know we had some slight changes in the schedule. Is that still possible for you? Yes?
It is.
Great,
yes.
thank you.
I might have to leave a little bit early, but
great.
I'm definitely staying.
Thank you very much. So I guess I'll invite our first speaker so that we can kind of try and get through the lectures, and then we'll have time to talk a bit more during the panel discussion. So, Granot, please come on up. Professor Granot is from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, from the musicology department. At the center of her research are questions related to emotional and cognitive responses to music and the relationship between these processes and music theory. I'll leave the rest to her. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me today. The truth is that when I was invited to this conference, I had very little idea about the content. I knew the word interdisciplinary was there. To be really honest, I prepared nothing. I'm going to play it by ear, but I do want to share with you a few thoughts, and maybe the one last study or a recent study I published that may or may not invoke some thoughts that are related to the topic. So first, I want to say that the question of disciplines and inter and intra is very interesting, but for me, I start from a research question. So there are endless research questions. I'm interested in those that are related to music cognition, and this is a vast field. For example, I've been exploring the question of how surprises and predictions, or I should say predictions and then surprises in music, elicit response, emotional and brain responses when we listen to such surprises in music. So since surprise is something that is sometimes conscious, but many times beyond our consciousness, once you want to study such questions, you might need to go to measures that are not accessible to consciousness, such as a person telling you, yes, this was a surprising moment. You may need to resort to other measures. And so what counts for me is the question. You then look for the theoretical framework that is related to that question. And in our field, we can say that we are leading the topic of surprise and prediction, because Leonard Meyer in 1956 talked about how this element is such important in our emotional response to music, and he had very little empirical evidence, but for him as a musician, as an aesthetician, as a person who thought about music in analytical terms, it was very clear that meaning in music and emotion music is related to the way we listen to sentences or harmonies as they progress, and at each moment we have a pretty clear idea of what is going to come next, or we don't have any idea, but at any rate, this is part of what makes music intriguing, interesting, but also very emotional. And in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, at least for the last 25 years, in neuroscience, the idea of the predictive brain, the idea that we constantly predict what's going to happen, and actually our perception, our thought is mostly a conversation between the input we get from our senses and the top-down expectations that we have, has been very central to how we think about the brain in general, not only in relation to music. So this is how we cross from aesthetic ideas to neuroscience. So in the few minutes that I have, maybe I will not even show you any slides. I want to talk about another question that I'm interested in, or have been interested in the last 10 years or so, which crosses out very different boundaries, and is related to how music helps us obtain well-being, emotional balance. And we know from our own experiences, but a lot of data has been collected, not to mention all the therapy people, maybe some of them are here, who know that that music has many, many benefits for our emotional world. People use music to change their arousal level, maybe to relax, maybe to get more energized. People use music to ventilize negative emotions. They often report, at least adolescents often report, that they use music just to feel very strong emotions. They want to experience a strong emotion, and then they resort to music. Music can contain contradicting emotions at the same time, which is something we find maybe difficult to cope with in life, but it's there in music. Music can take us through some sort of voyage, or from one point to another, and through it we go and change what we think. And music does other 1,000 different wonderful things to our emotional world. But then you might ask, if music is so wonderful, why do we need words? Because finally, most of the time, most of the people listen to songs. They don't listen to instrumental music on its own, despite the absolute music of the 19th century and the idea that music goes directly to the heart and doesn't need anything else. So following this line of studies, one problem with studying emotional responses to music in the lab is how to create an emotional situation in the lab. And in 2020, we had a big emotional transglobal event, which is the corona. So at that time, we decided to study how people use music to regulate their emotions cross-culturally. So we had participants from 11 countries, including some countries in South America, which is very unique in the world of music cognition, because the world of music cognition usually studies Western people in universities. So we had over 6,000 participants, and they answered questionnaires. No brain, no other technological, fancy technological stuff. But within that study, we asked people to provide the names or the YouTube links to songs that helped them through that very stressful and fearful time. So we had now over 2,000 such links from very different countries, and now we had to analyze these 2,000 songs. And what we did was to try and find recurring topics, semantic topics in these songs, using topic algorithm, LLM, whatever you may want to call it. I will not go into details because this is not the part I did, but my colleague Peles. There are tools now to analyze songs. I have to say that mostly lyrics of songs have been analyzed as reflecting changes of values and beliefs in society. How certain topics become more popular in these lyrics may be related to love or sex or drugs or violence or, I don't know, peace. Amen. They have not been analyzed as part of the experience of those listening to them. So we analyzed the topics, and at the same time, we analyzed through the Essentia algorithm the acoustic features of these songs, which is problematic because I don't know if you're familiar with this algorithm. It's been trained on songs of Spotify of the last years, but we had songs that range from very different countries and very different eras. To cut a long story short, the real thing to do is not to analyze the lyrics separately and the music separately. We would like to analyze each song as a gestalt, because this is how songs work, no? And I offer you the challenge of doing it in 2,000 or million songs. So this is one big question. If we can scale up from analyzing single songs with sensitivity and the knowledge that we have about metaphors, about the meaning of life, and how music supports this with its palette of options, if we can scale this up to look at larger numbers of songs and maybe understand something new. And this is where I'm going to stop and give the platform to the next speaker. Thank you.
Next up is Snir. He's a composer, improviser, and installation artist. He's currently splitting his time between Reichman University and Tel Aviv University. He teaches, amongst other things, composition in Tel Aviv, and then in Reichman University, he works in a lab working on topics very much like Roni was mentioning. So he's already an interesting kind of interdisciplinarian right there. All right.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. And today I'm going to talk about the other side of my work, so what I've been actually doing in the last few years. Aside from being a musician essentially my entire life and working with music technology quite a bit, I found myself a bit by accident becoming a researcher. I've been doing some neuroscience, and I will just talk a bit about one of the projects that I've been dealing with along with the team at Reichman University. So in the lab that I work at, which is the Bar-Ilan Institut for Brain Cognition and Technology, basically I run this environment that is we have 97 speakers and we do higher order ambisonics, and we use these in-house made tactile devices, and we have sound transparent screens. And the reason for all this is that what we do, this lab was of course formed by Professor Amir, who's a known researcher for multisensory integration. And what we do in the lab, and the reason that there is this facility, is in order to research how senses integrate, right? And aside from that, to also develop technologies in which we can use to has something that's called to use for sensory substitution, meaning basically that we take information that is meant for one sense and move it to the other. And this involves quite a lot of algorithm writing and tweaking, where basically we will take, I will show some examples in a moment. So I will just mention that a lot of this work was in close collaboration with another postdoctoral researcher at the lab named Katarzyna Cześla, and her background is in hearing impaired and MRI research. Okay, so how did I find myself there? This is a concert from 2018. I'm just going to play a short excerpt in which the setting for the concert is there's a live ensemble on stage. I'm there in the middle, and these are Elad Baldas and Ofer Baime. We're playing together, going through a surround speaker system. It uses an ambisonic surrounding, and we also have installed at the front of the stage loudspeakers for guitar amplifiers with distortion pedals, all this kind of stuff. And you can see that, I will show in a second, basically you can see my feet are controlling the entire environment and sending the ensemble around the audience. We get sound. מה זה? of the interesting things that happened was my father actually, a few years before, lost hearing in one of his ears. And what happened was that he was complaining all the time and making it very clear that he cannot understand where sounds are coming from. And for me, doing this kind of work and moving further into spatial audio field, I started to get the feeling that he's, never going to be really able to be involved in this in a situation like this. So I started. So when I found myself at doing this kind of work and getting into the multisensory research, I realized that there's a potential here that I found quite interesting. So if we, now I'm just going to jump right over to the projects themselves and the theory, the ideas behind it. So if we consider the senses, right, visual, audio, and touch. So visual is going to obviously be front-oriented. The auditory sense is going to be surrounding us, right? So I can hear things from all directions, right? Different directions, different distances. And touch is quite an interesting sense because on the one hand, it's not that used if we don't have anything directly touching our body. But when it does touch our body, we tend to associate it directly with that position on the body. Now, the question is, can we take this kind of touch experience and move it to something that would help, right, with the auditory spatial experience? Okay, so just very basic, I'm not going to get into the details, but essentially the two main well-known cues for understanding spatial information through touch are the time differences and the level differences between the ears. So if a sound arrives to one ear before it arrives to the next ear, then we can assume, right, our brain calculates it basically, and by this difference in time and by this difference in level also that is caused by the shadow of the head, right? The sound source, it comes from an angle. Touch goes over the head, and when it arrives at the other ear, it also loses some energy. And so by these differences, our brain can quite quickly, or it has to quite quickly calculate the angle at which the sound arrives. There are other spectral cues that come into play, but these are the very basic elements that I want to talk about, because they're, in a moment you'll see why they're the relevant ones. So if we look at a normal textbook division of the brain, what we will usually see is this kind of division that is essentially structured by the different senses. And what we're trying to do is to see whether once we provide the information in a proper way for the brain, it could be used in order to impact the way that we perceive, for instance, in this case, audio, right? So what we're going to start doing, and we'll get to this in a moment, but to start providing tactile feedback and to see whether this can be used to become part of the auditory system. Okay, so elephants. Why are elephants interesting? Well, elephants actually have quite a cool feature. They are able to create calls through the ground between herds and between elephants, and they can pass auditory sound information basically through the ground between the herds. Not only can they do this, but they can also put 3 legs on the ground. You can see them do this kind of little lift. I saw some images of this. And what they do is triangulation to understand where the sound is coming from. And when they do this, they can also respond to it accordingly. So if some elephant needs help, and this provided quite an interesting inspiration for us, because what it seems is that the elephants actually combine this information, they integrate it with the information that comes to their ears. So doing this kind of tactile stuff, there's some history to it. So right, already in 57, some researchers were looking into a possibility of transforming, in a very mechanical sense, auditory information to tactile. And they were even doing stuff with localization, as you can see here on the two right panels there. But this was quite frankly, it was abandoned because what started to develop very nicely was this thing that is called a cochlear implant. And when this started showing promise, then a lot of this other multisensory stuff got kind of put to the side. So what does a cochlear implant do, right? You have this little, it's kind of like a little spring, and you put it directly into the cochlea and it activates electrically, the neuroreceptors, that are behind there, and it basically provides some sort of auditory input. Now, why are cochlear implants relevant here? Because aside from the case of my father that I gave an example of earlier, which is unilateral hearing, cochlear implant users are also known to be to have a very hard time with localization specifically, and hint, which we'll talk about later, but music as well. Okay, so this is just a picture. You can see me sitting in this room, and just to show what is the facility actually that we use to do the experiment. So these little boxes have tactile actuators, which are used in combination with an algorithm that basically reproduces. It uses the weighting, right? We were talking about the ears earlier, this weighting of levels and time. It inspired by this, it reproduces locations in the environment, and these locations can actually, they're virtual positions, so they can be matched to what is happening in the audio environment of the speaker setup, right? And so what it allows us to do is do stuff like, we have a sound moving from here to there, from there to here, and we ask participants to tell us what is this sound doing, to follow it around and explain, and we can see that they're able to do this, which I will show you in just one moment. Sorry. Okay, this is from last year's publication on this. So these are not yet hearing impaired, but you can see that typically hearing are able to use this information also with tactile alone. When we give them vertical information as well, then they're still lower, of course, than audio, but this is after about 20 minutes of training. So it's quite interesting that using just the weighting between actuators on the fingers, people are able to perceive positions, motions in space. Not only that, when we take the group of congenitally hearing impaired users of cochlear implants, which basically means that they were born deaf and then were implanted with the cochlear implants, you can see the huge difference, right? It's these middle gray ones. You can see on the left their ability to do tasks in audio, and on the right, the ability to do it in audio and tactile. When we add it, and on this here, you can see audio and then tactile alone. The reason congenitally, in particular, are an interesting group is because when people are born without a particular ability, it tells us a lot about how basically sensory development works, right? So if someone is born deaf, and because they were only implanted with cochlear implants, they don't have, as we can see here, a very good, the line, by the way, is chance, right? So they're just above chance. They don't have a good ability to understand their environment. This raises questions regarding representation of spatial understanding, regardless of our sensory input, right? Okay, I'm going to show a quick... Just a second, I'll get back. I'm just going to show just a short piece. This is Dana and Tamar, two twins that came to us actually by surprise. They were brought by this TV show that came to interview Amir, the PI, and you can see them here experiencing this. We actually never tested it at this moment, This was before we did the research. And we just had the technology. They said we're just bringing these girls. They were both born deaf, twins, and they both were installed with a cochlear implant in childhood. Just a moment.
פותחים ל5 צלילים, והצלילים האלה זזים פה במרחב.
יש ציפור וינשוף בג'ונגל, אנחנו בג'ונגל.
נכון, בג'ונגל כזה, בדיוק. אחד מהצלילים מחובר לך לאצבעות, תתרכזי 20 שניות ותגידי לי.
ינשוף.
אבל זה לא עבור 20 שניות,
נכון, מצטער, אתה כל כך מרגיש.
מדהים, מדהים. עכשיו בוא ננסה להגיד לי איפה הצליל נמצא. תניעי את הראש, תפר ינשוף, עם הרגל. בוא נראה. את שומעת את הינשוף?
כן, אבל אני לא יודעת איפה.
הנה, והיא מצביעה בדיוק איפה שהראש לך מצביעה.
אני חייב להגיד שזה מטורף, כי אני לא שומע מה שהיא... תקשיבו, אם זה...
Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead. These are just the results of the experiment that they were basically piloting. So you can see the hearing impaired group and the typically hearing in gray. Their results, their ability to recognize audio tactile sources in space. And this, just to jump ahead, this is a second algorithm that was developed specifically to transform music to tactile, and we install these actuators on people's ankles, hands, and chest. And what we see is actually an emotional influence impact that happens when we add the tactile actuation to a musical experience. It actually works, it just converts directly from Spotify or whatever you want. You can just stream music through it. And this is what we use to run the experiment, but I'm out of time, so I can't get into details. Just to say thank you to some of the people in the group that were involved in this research. And just the very last comment, just to think about how this is important to how we think of ourselves as, as a musician group, which is, I think, most of the audience here today, that we consider the importance of what we experience through our body to what we hear as well. I know this was a bit quick, but I think there are some very aside from the importance of assistive devices that can be used. I think it also tells us quite a lot about potentially what we experience with music as being part of embodiment and the sort. Yeah. So thanks for listening.
We'll move right on to Cohen, who is joining us from the Weizmann Institute of Science. I'll also mention that Adi has a piece in the concert not right after the lunch break. After the lunch break, there's 2 concerts. It's the second half of that pair. So you'll get to hear some of his music using spatialized sound. So, we'll take a moment to connect the computer.
Okay. So hi everybody. We stumbled upon a neuroscientist. That's me. Hi, I'm Yarden, from the Weizmann Institute. And we'll talk about, very briefly about what my lab is all about, which is, if I give it a nifty title, is about asking how does the brain compose. And I know I'm in a room full of composers, so I'll try to define what it means to me at least, which is basically how our brain controls the sequences of our behaviors. So often when we think about sequential behaviors, we tend to think about these kind of people, about experts, people that trained a lot, and they can of course improvise and in a very high level. But if they wish to, they can produce very precise sequences of behaviors, a sequence of notes, or whatever magic that Simon Biles is doing here. Right? They can do it again and again in a very stereotyped manner. But these are special cases. Most people, yes, me at least, when we produce our behavior repertoires, we're very noisy. Right? It's very hard for us to do things precisely in the same way. And so our behavior sequences, we tend to describe them as following certain types of rules that I will call sensory motor sequence or syntax rules. Right? And a good example comes from language, where the sequences of words is what we're all about, and when we want to convey meaning. And to me, at least, in my definition, a syntax rules is what governs certain points or decisions or transitions in a sequence. For example, if we say a sequence of words like canaries like two, and then we can actually choose or pick the next word. It could be sing or fly, and maybe we do that with the same probability. If I replace the first word in the sentence, let's say with the neuroscientists, now the probabilities of the transitions here will change, right? I guess, because neuroscientists tend to like to sing and not so much to fly. And so what we have here is what the syntax rule created, which is a history-dependent transition. The transition here depends on what happened several steps back. Okay, and this is just an example, but this happens, of course, in a variety of behaviors, and we care to ask, how does the brain control the syntax in which repertoires of behavior sequences? So what we want to know is how the brain drives each action in the sequence, right? What is the new activity states that drive each behavior element? And then what are the mechanisms for transitioning between one element and the next to create syntax rules? And so this will be our conceptual window about how does the brain work. Every different lab has a different window to look at the brain, and it is ours. And you want to study a model of behavior that is learned and used for social interaction. And so obviously, we study songbirds, right? Okay, so which bird should we study? What you see here, this cute little fellow here, is the zebra finch. It's the most studied songbird in systems neuroscience, exactly because these birds learn and then very precisely produce a single sequence of notes or syllables that they will present here by letters, right? And those are known to be driven by very precise sequences of premotor neural states. And some other songbirds, so you can think about them as the Simone Biles, or at least one very stereotyped producer of behavior. Some other labs study more variable singers, like the Bengalese finches here, that you can have points in their song where they can transition from one syllable to multiple others. But what we study in the lab are different singers. We study canaries. These guys. Right, it's about a very, very short snippet from a full song of a canary with the sonogram, so the time and frequency representation of song just below it, exemplifying that we can identify individual notes, as individual repeating marks here on the sonogram, and we can, of course, give them letters in the same way that it was done here to find that canaries produce huge repertoires of songs, right? They compose huge repertoires of songs. And so these are just typical examples of canary songs. If you gave each syllable a letter, if you played the same game of looking at transition diagrams between the possible syllables of a bird, we find that canaries have, some of them have between 30 and 50 different syllable types, and these are the kind of transition diagrams we can make. And you can already see that there are some rules, right, to this madness. For one example, canaries have a hierarchical structure to their song. Each syllable is repeated multiple times, different number of repeats in different songs. These are called phrases, or recorded phrases. And if we look at the sequence of phrases, what we see is that we find transitions, right, that depend on the history of the song in much the same way that we found transitions in this example that depended on what happened earlier in the sequence. And so these rich repertoires of canary song that are sensory motor sequences, they have hierarchical and flexible syntax. Like all bird songs, they are learned. Birds learn to sing from their parents mostly, but from older birds. And they're used, of course, for communication. And what's special about canaries compared to other songbirds, but especially at least compared to the finches that are being studied, is that canaries are also open-ended level. They can actually reopen their sensitive period every year. This is and relearn how to sing, basically. This is accompanied by massive circuit dynamics of changes in their brain actually circuitry as they do it. So today, in the some time that I have, I'll show you a brief example of the experimental access that we have to study how the canary brain composes their song. At least one question about it. Right? We want to know how can canaries produce their variable song sequences that also have these long-range dependencies in syntax. Syntactic dependencies meaning dependent influence on the currently going choice of the next element, depending on what happened in the longer range context. Okay, so I'll jump right in and save you a lot of introduction and just tell you that we already know a set of what we call brain nuclei or regions in the birdsong brain. I'll show you just an illustration of it. These colored circles will be nuclei. And we already know from studies mostly in finches and zebra finches that there is a pathway of activity in these nuclei that basically is the premotor control of song. So there will be a descending pathway that ends up producing let's say a note. And what we already know about these, the neural states in this pathway basically is producing individual notes. So let's open up this box. And what we know about it, very briefly, that in this apex nucleus HVC, names don't matter, there's a sequence, a very stereotyped sequence of activity. Think about it as a time code. There will be a sequence of activity of individual or groups of neurons. This is what drives the next premotor stage, nucleus RA, to produce, basically this already innervates the motor neurons and basically plays the keyboard or the musical instrument, in this case the music instrument that the birds have in their upper chest. It's about group of about 8 muscles in each side of this music box. And so this precise activity pattern in the top nucleus drives a precise activity pattern in the premotor next stage, which basically drives a precise or stereotyped syllable. And the entire thing, which I call the neural state in a box, is stereotyped enough. And if I hear one syllable being sung, and I see even one neuron here being active, I can imagine the entire thing, the entire premotor program is being played. This is the key point to take from here, which allows me then to look at individual neurons active in different syllables as representatives of the neural states that underlie those syllables. So what we can do in the lab is to go to a canary and position a microscope on top of its HVC nucleus. It's a miniscope, so I don't know how many of you have fluorescence microscopes in your labs, maybe all of you. And they're really big devices. They are about this big and weigh about 20 kilograms. But we miniaturize them, we 3D print these little things and insert small optical devices in them. And so they are about yay big and they weigh about 2 grams. So we can position them on the head of the bird, make a small hole, look inside, and the rest of the bird is actually intact. And we can image the activity of individual neurons. This will be a very processed video here. They will have different colors, even the activity patterns. They're not really different colors, they're boring green, but I color-coded them for you. So what you'll see here is the bird, not this one has no microscope, but fine, singing, the activity in the brain, and then below that, the annotation of the song. If you remember that each one of these neurons in this nucleus HVC represent a premotor activity pattern that plays a syllable, this is the orchestra in the bird's brain that plays its song. Okay, so we can open up this data, we'll have a look at it. It will be the, over time, the activity of each one of the neurons, we call them regions of interest, but fine, neurons, aligned in time to the amplitude of the sound, which is color-coded here for the different syllable types of sound. The syllable types is Bird was able to produce. And already in this one data set, you can see a few things. For example, despite the fact that the imaging technique is quite crude and we can't see very fast signals in the neurons, we can, at least in cases where the bird is singing kind of slow syllables, like here, we can identify cells that are active with each one of the syllables in a repetition of a syllable, right? And which means that if we think about premotor activity patterns that can create a sequence, they also can repeat, right, to create repetitions. And there's one more thing that we can see here clearly. In some cases, there's an activity of a neuron that's aligned to some element, let's say the yellow element here, but the same neuron is not active or active very weakly when the same element appears elsewhere in the song. And this is actually happening multiple times in this one video, right? Activity occurs strongly in one instance, one context, and weakly or not at all in another context in song. And this turns out to relate to the sequence of elements in songs, or to the syntax. So I'll be very quick about it, because I'm running out of time. But what I mean by that is that activity in the currently produced phrase in the canary sequence of phrases will modulate depending on other phrases in the sequence. What I'll call first order dependency will be activity in the current context that is going to be high, and in a different context, which is just the identity of a neighboring element, will be low or not existent. Okay, so here's an example for that. What you see is a raster, like every row here is a song, and in every song we look at the signal of one cell time aligned to the onset of some element in green here, and the bar on the left will tell you what was the identity of the preceding element. And it's a case, in this example, of a neuron active in a specific transition. And what I'll call a second order dependency will be neurons active, again, in the same fixed phrase, but then modulating with what happened two steps apart, and when the intermediate phrase is kept fixed, and the same idea again, activity will prefer some context. The same idea, every row here in this raster is a song. One neuron is active time aligned to the onset of the distinct phrase, and then the phrases on the colors on the left tell you what was the identity of the two preceding phrases, and this is the following phrase. So note that everything that changes in this figure, except the activity, is only the identity of the second preceding phrase type, so I'll call it a second order dependency, right? For completion, here are all the songs that had a distinct phrase during that day of activity. And of course, song is correlated to itself, so cells are not only correlating to the history of song, but also to the future of song. But it turns out it's much fewer of those. So many more cells modulate their activity depending on the preceding context compared to the following context, both first order and second or higher dependencies. So if we think about syntax rules that are active in the current transition and care about what happened earlier in the song, this is the kind of memory that we were looking for. The birds need to somehow remember what happened earlier in the song when they come to the current transition. So let me show you one example and finish up with that. Here's an example of two cells that are active during the production of the orange phrase, and they do it preferentially following one of the two histories here in color. You can see it in the raster of their activity. Again, it's the same idea. But in this case, we had a sequence of 4 consecutive phrases, and in each one, you can find neurons that encode not only drive the currently produced syllable, but also do it preferentially in a sense that encodes what happened, in this case, 2 phrases before, 3 or 4 phrases before. And remember that the phrase is a repetition of a syllable, so we're talking about a context dependence that goes back 4 or 5 seconds in time and bridges over 40 to 50 syllables. And so the final model that we come up with in this case, because if each neuron here represents a premotor activity pattern, and in this case producing the pink phrase, right, in the red context, right, it will be some premotor neural state. There has to be another premotor neural state that produces the pink element in this cyan context, right? So this allows us to imagine a model in which the birds has multiple representation of each one of the syllable types in the intermediate sequence here to relay the identity of the previous context to the current transition. And then in this way, create the syntax dependencies. And just to drive this point home, right, this creates this history-dependent transition. And because, to make this biologically plausible, we assume that if this is indeed something that birds use, we expect to find more of these representations of some context in the transitions that require some context, that depend, they have these syntactic dependencies, and this is what we found. The pie chart here separates first and second and higher order dependencies, and show you the fraction of cells that encoded some context dependencies in gray, dark gray, and in purple is what you'd expect to find by chance. This is a far stronger representation than chance, and therefore this is biologically plausible. And this is basically the take home. I'll show you one example of how the canary brain can compose by carrying the information in memory of a previous element as a redundant representation of the intermediate premotor state or the motor outputs to create these history-dependent transitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I like the sort of connection we've had going from speaker to speaker. Maybe you could see that. You could see the sort of trying to think about how the brain responds to music, and then how from being a musician you start thinking about spatiality and how the brain encodes spatiality. And then now we're looking deeper into the brain and now we're going to take a hard enough turn and think about how music affects us in a broader sense, because all of this fascination with how the brain understands music, it comes from, the way I see it, from a sort of self-evident truth that music and sound are fascinating to us. And so now let's take a bit of a different perspective with Amir Bolzman, who's joining us from Musrara, multidisciplinary sound artist, curator, and composer, head of the new music course at Musrara. He also studied at Musrara and the Royal Conservatory of The Hague. And he is also an active artist creating experimental music installations.
שלום, סליחה על העיכוב. טוב, אז אני אמיר, אני switch to English. When I was invited to do this presentation, I thought, what can I bring to this table? And my thoughts are that I can use this opportunity to think and talk about technology and how in the local perspective of it, not just maybe scientific view of technology, but how technology meet our society, and especially the Israeli society, the local one. And also in the spirit of this session title, No Sound in a Vacuum, creation doesn't happen in a vacuum, but rather within a cultural, social, and political fabric that we cannot ignore. That's what I believe. So I choose this very low-tech speaker that can be kind of a tool that we can look at 3 artworks or subworks made in the last 50 years. So this is the horn speaker. We call it in Hebrew shofar. It's a very cheap speaker. It's made now these days from aluminum or plastic. It used to be made also from fiberglass, but its main problem is that it can shoot sound very far, or farther than regular speaker. From a spectral perspective, it begins around 250 hertz, 300 hertz, and goes up and it's very efficient, mostly at the voice frequencies between 1K to 6K. So it's mainly used to broadcast or shout a vocal or alarm sounds. So it's not very useful to regular music, but to send information out. I grew up in and still live in Jerusalem. So I grew up and lived most of my life in Jerusalem. And as a city of religious majority, religious institutes in Jerusalem have kind of monopoly over the sonic space of the city. The Shabbat siren, the song that comes before the Shabbat siren, and of course the Muazzin call. Muazzin is the prayer from the mosque that invite people for the prayers. So you hear it all the time. You hear it 5 times a day. You hear it every Friday. You hear it the Shabbat. So you hear the speakers kind of invading our space in a good and in a wrong, or good or bad way. The sounds travels from one neighborhood in Jerusalem to another, from one space to the next, and that could be fascinating or aggravating. It makes other present in your space without your choosing, without you inviting them. It reaches across boundaries and lands in your home. We've always learned, we also learned this during this time of war, where sound is kind of popping out alarms, the drones, bomb sounds, so we are affected, but sounds that we didn't invite to come, but we hear them. So the first work I want to show you is called The Messenger. It's from 2011. It was made by the sound artist and great musician Daniel Peles. He was a student at Bezalel Academy in Har HaTzofim. And it's kind of a dialogue, personal dialogue he created from the sound from the village Isawiya that is in front of the Bezalel Academy. I will show you the first chapter of it. I hope you can hear it. So you can search it or send me an email, I can send you a link, or Daniel do it. The next word is called the Hamavdil. Hamavdil comes from the Havdalah, the ceremony at the end of the Shabbat, from the Shabbat to the regular week. This is a group I made with Salamanca Group, Lea Maues and Diego Rotman from the Mamuta Art and Research Center. And it's an intervention in the soundscape. This work is made in 2017. Around these days there was a law that the right-wing government wanted to pass that kind of will control the muazzin, that it's a noise problem in the area. And this work was made to try to kind of confuse the area and try to interfere in the soundscape and to propose a new idea of how a soundscape can be heard. This is the tower in Hansen's house. So here we kind of copied and put the shofar speakers on top of it. I will show a documentation of the work. And we used the Havdalah time, after the Shabbat went out, we played a ready-made recording of the Rabbi Moshe Chavusha sings the Havdalah in a Makam scale, in an Arabic Jews scale, and we played it in the speakers. So you will see it. in Musrara, just a week ago, in the festival where I teach. So the idea for the work came from this sound system that is used by this group called Achim Laneshek. This is I don't know how to call it, a performance installation or a political, or I don't know. They used this sound system in front and put it in front of the Gaza border. This was 10 years after the 7th of October, after the massacre. And it was used to shout and call to the Chatufim, to the hostages, thank you, and call their names and try to communicate with them. But the work of Daniel is very similar and is really not aggressive. He used 16 shofars because very small, but the sound is very tender. You see this very big system, but the sound is very soft and poetic. And it used a cluster of sine waves that he kind of manipulated from the names of the people that were murdered during the 7th of October, and kind of used gematria and calculation to give each one a sine tone, a pure tone to represent him. So we will hear 2 minutes from this piece that he sent me. Okay, I think we will finish with that. Our time is short. Thank you very much.
Amir, apologies for all the trouble starting this up. Thank you for reading the presentation. So we're going to have a panel now with for the 4 speakers you just heard. Unfortunately, with the delays, Marko couldn't stick with us any longer, but we have more than enough to talk about, more than enough people to talk about it with. Let's start with some of the bigger questions that we sort of put up for this discussion when we were talking about organizing this conference, and I think I sent some of you these questions in advance. I guess I'm gonna start with the big one. Where does music end and other fields start? Where do you see that boundary? Is it a boundary? How fuzzy is it? I think we saw, especially with Amir's sort of turn to a different perspective towards the end of this sequence. We saw a very wide range of ways to think about these phenomena. I'll start with a D, and then you can pass it around. I'm just gonna drop you in there because I know you personally, and I feel comfortable telling you to be first.
Yeah. To me, it's not very clear where one starts and the other ends, but I will say that I think the goals, or at least the way that I experience it, when you take part in scientific research as opposed to music research, I think sometimes the order is very different in which you work. For me, at least, I'm only doing research with humans, which, and perhaps the other them will have different thoughts about this, but with humans, you start with the experience, and then you follow to their responses, and then you analyze the data, and what actually gets published or what goes out to the public is the data. It's the result of what was experienced, and I think with music, what happens is that what the public experiences is the updating and correcting of the experience itself, right? And in that sense, it's almost like it's almost reversed. And I think that that for me, this cycle has been very interesting, going between one and the other. So kind of finding these experiences, understanding their musical potential, but at the same time going back to these music experiences or their potential, and kind of updating the theory based on that, and then going back to see how you can research that again. And so, I think if you think about it technologically to begin with, then there's kind of this crossover that is constant.
So technologically it's the same tools, but then what you're talking about is there's a process of, and well, you described very specifically how your musical experience sort of led to stumbling into a lab, essentially. But then now you're saying that also what you do in the lab then informs what you do with your music?
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know, we certainly know that Amir is also an active musician, and I know that you're also a musicologist, but still I'd like to hear from Roni and then Yarden, just especially of them maybe, because we heard from you a perspective that is, this lab, neuroscience lab. As far as we know, maybe you don't even, never even touched an instrument. So I'm curious to hear how you kind of got into this sort of. Yes. So one after the other. Yeah, that works.
Well, I think there is a continuum here, because I think there is a continuum here because music is beyond anything else, or I would say it is sound and it is body. The sensory motor that Ben was talking about is also crucial in humans. Music is not something we listen to. Music is something that involves the whole body, and anytime we see someone listening to music, we look at the brain, and even though the person is not moving anything, all the motor systems are working because there are sequences in there, because there is time to be ordered in there, And so this is one part that is very, very important that I think connects all of us. The embodiment and the loop that is the sensory motor loop. Also, the notion of communication. We have language, but we have very different ways of communicating. And I see music as a way of communicating emotionally, and it can communicate other messages like I love you, or I want to protect my territory, or it can be the birds, or it can be the auditory space in Jerusalem, no? So I see it, you know, I can see a very nice line connecting us.
Yeah, that was my answer. No, I'll add one more thing to it, because it's what happens to you when you work with animal models, which is what we often do, not in Amir and Maggie's group, but in our group. And we tend to forget, right? We anthropomorphize and we study exactly the questions that you are pointing to, I mean, the communication, the perception, the productions, and some of the experience. And basically all different ways of looking at, oh, these are functions of the brain, so how does the brain do it? But we don't study it in our case in the human brain, but in a songbird brain, and then try to say, oh, because we have better access, but then can we generalize from it? But we mustn't forget that the birds experience the world in a very different way. First, they can fly, and not you can fly. But also, and just it brings me to this, the name escapes me now, but it's quite old, somebody who recorded the songs of many different bird species, and then played them back, but slowed down. And suddenly, like from what seems to be a chirp, like a very brief chirp, you see a complete harmonic progression. These are amazing recordings, which may mean that the birds are experiencing their own songs in different rates. There are nuances that we tend to group together. Oh, this is the same syllable, but for them they are completely different. And so when we approach this in research, when we impose our own definitions, but we also need to remember that our models can have a different, curse word, qualia, of what's going on. And this, I think, also can generalize to everybody else's research topics, because even though you have a model in humans, it is still a model for humans.
If anyone has any closing thoughts, or if anyone in the audience has a short question or two to this panel.
Gilad?
ירדן.
הקנארי האלה, יש להם, do they have any sense of syntax that relates to cadence? Cadence, when they finish something,
So
do you
prosody?
know?
You mean prosody?
Yeah, something that equivalent to our cadences in music.
Starting a phrase, ending a
The
phrase.
second point, do they have a sense of building a climax or anything that is into a climax and out of climax, as we do in counterpoint. Okay?
Yeah, I'm going to seriously disappoint you. There's much that we actually don't know about canary song in the field of neuroscience, at least, because it's been quite tough to study them before we had modern tools, so most studies were done in other songbirds. We have little knowledge about them changing their behavior in the presence of let's say, an audience. So these are courtship songs. They used to court females, and they will introduce more often certain types of notes, and the female will be responsive to these notes. And we know that. We know in some species, we don't know that about canaries, that the tempo will change when there's a female around, so zebrafinches are like that. Their songs will be more stereotyped, less variable. I mean, the sequence is the same, but acoustic variability. When they are performing to the audience, and when they're alone, we say that they're practice, but they're more variable, and they need to do that in order to be able to perform reliably to females. And then the tempo increases when they produce sound to a female. The brain temperature also increases.
But there is no pattern equal to our cadence.
In a sense of different part of song being...
When they finish song, do we have something recurring that you can say, oh, I identify that as the cadence, or they just stop?
No, so there's definitely structure that has to do with the progression of song, but I'm speaking from the perspective of the individual properties of individual birds. We don't know the language of birds, if I want to be more specific here. We don't know anything that generalizes too much across canaries, apart from those syllable types I described, because we haven't even studied it. We do know that within individual birds, we can identify different motifs, and of course different types of elements that will end the song. But this is within individuals.
So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much to our speakers.